Imagine a man walking through Jerusalem's narrow streets in the dead of night. His footsteps echo against ancient stones. His heart pounds with a rhythm that matches neither his measured pace nor his carefully composed expression. This is no ordinary midnight journey. This is the walk of a soul caught between two worlds. The man carries no torch, yet he knows these pathways by memory. He has walked them in daylight countless times, surrounded by reverence and recognition. But tonight, darkness is his companion. Tonight he seeks answers that his position forbids him to pursue in the light of day. His name is Nicodemus. To the people of Jerusalem, he is a pillar of religious authority, a teacher of teachers, a man whose word carries the weight of divine interpretation. But beneath the carefully maintained exterior lies something far more complex. A heart wrestling with questions that threaten to shatter everything he has built his life upon. What drives a man of such stature to abandon the safety of his reputation? What compels someone who has spent decades interpreting ancient laws to suddenly question the very foundation of his understanding? And why, when the most pivotal moment in human history unfolds before his eyes, does he emerge from the shadows carrying 75 pounds of burial spices? This is not merely the story of a biblical character mentioned in passing. This is the journey of a soul transformed by an encounter so profound that it would redefine the meaning of courage itself. From the safety of midnight conversations to the bold declaration of public devotion, Nicodemus walked a path that few would dare to follow. Tonight we uncover the untold story of the secret disciple who buried the king. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the temple as Nicodemus adjusted his prayer shawl and prepared for another day of teaching. The year was approximately 33 in the Common Era, and Jerusalem pulsed with the complex rhythms of a city caught between ancient traditions and Roman occupation. The air carried the mingled scents of burning incense, freshly baked bread, and the dust that seemed to settle into every corner of the holy city. For a man of Nicodemus's standing, each day began before dawn with private prayers and contemplation of the sacred texts. His home, likely situated in one of Jerusalem's more prosperous districts, would have been filled with scrolls containing the wisdom of generations. The walls themselves seemed to whisper with the voices of rabbis and scholars who had shaped the understanding of divine law for centuries. As a Pharisee and member of the Sanhedrin, Nicodemus occupied a position that few could attain and fewer still could maintain with honor. The Pharisees were not merely religious teachers but guardians of tradition. In an era when tradition itself faced unprecedented challenges, they interpreted the law, settled disputes, and served as the bridge between the common people and the sacred mysteries that governed every aspect of Jewish life. The Sanhedrin, that supreme council of 71 members, represented the highest earthly authority in matters of religious law. To sit among these men meant that one's voice carried weight in decisions that affected entire communities. It meant being entrusted with the preservation of a way of life that stretched back through generations of faithful adherence to divine commandments. Yet for all the authority and respect that surrounded him, Nicodemus found himself increasingly troubled by questions that seemed to have no satisfying answers. The traditional interpretations that had once brought him such certainty now felt somehow incomplete, as if they were shadows of a greater truth that remained just beyond his grasp. The political climate of first-century Jerusalem only intensified these internal struggles. Roman eagles perched atop buildings that had once known only the symbols of Israel's God. Tax collectors moved through the streets with the authority of an occupying force, while zealots whispered of rebellion in corners where Roman ears could not hear. The temple itself, that magnificent structure that Herod had rebuilt to rival any wonder of the ancient world, stood as both a symbol of divine presence and a reminder of political compromise. In this atmosphere of tension and uncertainty, religious leaders like Nicodemus faced an almost impossible task. They were expected to maintain the purity of ancient teachings while navigating the practical realities of life under Roman rule. They were called to be shepherds of souls while serving as administrators of a complex religious bureaucracy. They were meant to preserve tradition while addressing questions that tradition had never been forced to answer. The common people looked to the Pharisees for guidance. But what could one say to a widow whose husband had been crucified for opposing Roman taxation? How could one explain the ways of a loving God to children who had watched their fathers dragged away for speaking too boldly about freedom? The weight of these unspoken questions pressed down upon Nicodemus's shoulders like a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. His scholarly training had prepared him to debate the finer points of ceremonial law, to determine the proper offerings for various transgressions, and to settle disputes about the observance of holy days. But nothing in his education had equipped him to address the deeper spiritual hunger he sensed in the people around him. Nothing had prepared him for the growing awareness that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to divine truth than even the most learned scholars understood. The marketplace conversations he overheard spoke of strange teachings and miraculous healings. Fishermen and tax collectors were reportedly abandoning their occupations to follow an itinerant teacher from Nazareth. Stories circulated of water being turned to wine, of lepers cleansed with a touch, of the dead raised to life. Most disturbing of all, this teacher spoke with an authority that needed no validation from the established religious hierarchy. As Nicodemus walked through the temple courts, observing the familiar rituals and hearing the familiar prayers, a question began to form in the depths of his heart. What if everything he had been taught to believe about the nature of divine revelation was only a partial understanding of something far greater? What if the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was preparing to reveal himself in ways that would challenge every assumption about how the sacred intersects with the earthly? These were dangerous thoughts for a man in his position. They were questions that could undermine not only his own standing, but the entire structure of religious authority that maintained order in an increasingly chaotic world. Yet they were questions that refused to be silenced. Questions that grew stronger with each report of this teacher's extraordinary words and deeds. The evening prayers that had once brought Nicodemus such peace now seemed to echo with an undertone of incompleteness. The ancient words were still beautiful, still sacred, but they felt like the beginning of a conversation rather than its conclusion. As he prepared for sleep each night, Nicodemus found himself wondering what it would mean to encounter divine truth in its fullness, unfiltered by centuries of interpretation and tradition. The oil lamp flickered against the limestone walls of Nicodemus's private study. As he bent over the sacred scrolls that had been his companions for decades, the parchment beneath his fingers bore the weight of generations, each word carefully preserved by scribes whose devotion to accuracy bordered on the sacred. Yet tonight the familiar texts seemed to whisper questions rather than provide answers. At an age when most men had settled into the comfortable rhythms of established wisdom, Nicodemus found himself wrestling with doubts that threatened to unravel everything he had built his identity upon. His reputation as a teacher of Israel had been earned through years of careful study, thoughtful interpretation, and unwavering commitment to the traditions of his fathers. Students sought his guidance, colleagues respected his insights, and the common people looked to him as a bridge between their daily struggles and the eternal truths that governed their lives. But success in the religious sphere had not quieted the restlessness in his soul. If anything, his deep knowledge of Scripture had made him more aware of the mysteries that remained unsolved, the promises that seemed to point towards something beyond current understanding. The prophetic writings spoke of a time when God himself would walk among his people, when the barriers between heaven and earth would be removed, when the knowledge of divine glory would cover the earth as waters cover the sea. These were not merely academic concepts for Nicodemus. They were the longings of a heart that had tasted enough of divine truth to recognize how much more remained to be discovered. His colleagues might be satisfied with their ability to interpret the law and settle religious disputes, but Nicodemus sensed that they were all missing something essential, something that would transform their understanding of what it meant to serve the living God. The reports that reached his ears about the teacher from Nazareth both intrigued and unsettled him. This was no ordinary rabbi seeking to establish his own school of interpretation. The stories spoke of authority that transcended human learning, of insights that cut through centuries of accumulated tradition to touch the very heart of divine intention. Even more disturbing were the accounts of miraculous healings and supernatural signs that seemed to accompany this teacher's ministry. Nicodemus had spent his life studying the scriptures that spoke of such things, but he had never expected to encounter them in his own generation. The age of miracles was supposed to be past, relegated to the heroic narratives of ancient times when God had intervened more directly in human affairs. Yet here were credible witnesses speaking of the blind receiving sight, the lame walking, and even the dead being raised to life. The internal conflict this created was almost unbearable. As a scholar, Nicodemus was trained to examine evidence carefully and draw reasoned conclusions. The testimonies about Jesus of Nazareth were too numerous and too consistent to dismiss easily. But as a leader in the religious establishment, he was expected to maintain order and protect the community from false teachings and dangerous innovations. His position on the Sanhedrin meant that every public statement he made carried weight far beyond his personal opinions. A casual comment could influence policies that affected thousands of people. A theological position could shift the balance of power within the religious hierarchy. The responsibility was both an honor and a burden that pressed down upon him with increasing intensity. Yet despite all the external pressures and expectations, Nicodemus could not escape the growing conviction that he was living in extraordinary times, that the God of his fathers was preparing to act in ways that would challenge every human assumption about the nature of divine revelation. The teacher from Nazareth might indeed be a false prophet or a dangerous revolutionary, but what if he was something else entirely? What if he was the fulfillment of promises that faithful Jews had been hoping for across centuries of waiting? The very possibility filled Nicodemus with a mixture of hope and terror. Hope because it would mean that the longings of his heart for genuine encounter with the divine were not merely wishful thinking. Terror because it would mean that everything he had thought he understood about God's ways in the world was about to be turned upside down. As the night deepened around his solitary vigil, Nicodemus made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life forever. He would seek out this teacher privately, away from the scrutinizing eyes of his colleagues and the expectations of his position. He would ask the questions that burned in his heart and see for himself whether the reports about Jesus of Nazareth contained even a grain of divine truth. The decision was simultaneously an act of courage and an acknowledgement of fear. Courage because it meant risking his reputation and standing to pursue truth wherever it might lead. Fear because he suspected that once he looked directly into the eyes of this teacher, nothing in his carefully ordered world would ever be quite the same again. The marketplace buzzed with more than the usual commerce and conversation as Nicodemus made his way through the familiar streets of Jerusalem. Beneath the surface chatter about grain prices and wedding preparations, he caught fragments of other discussions. Whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when recognized figures approached. The name of Jesus of Nazareth seemed to drift through the air like incense, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to fully grasp. A merchant's wife leaned close to her neighbor, speaking in hushed tones about a wedding in Cana where water had somehow become wine. Not cheap wine, she insisted, but wine of such quality that the wedding master had been amazed. The story should have sounded like idle gossip, the kind of exaggerated tale that grew with each telling. Yet something in the woman's voice, a note of wonder mixed with certainty, gave Nicodemus pause. Near the temple steps, he overheard a group of fishermen discussing their recent return from the shores of Galilee. Their weathered faces carried expressions that Nicodemus had rarely seen among men of their station, a combination of joy and bewilderment that spoke of experiences beyond their ability to fully comprehend. One of them gestured animatedly as he described nets so full of fish that boats had nearly sunk under the weight of the catch. These were not the kinds of men given to flights of fancy or religious enthusiasm. They were practical people whose lives depended on their ability to read wind and weather, to distinguish between schools of fish and empty water. If they spoke of miraculous catches and teachings that pierced their hearts like arrows of light, perhaps there was more substance to the stories than Nicodemus had initially assumed. The signs were everywhere for those who had eyes to see them. In the temple courts, he noticed changes in the demeanor of some of the regular worshippers. There was a quality of expectation in their prayers, a sense that they were not merely reciting familiar words, but actually conversing with a God who might respond in unexpected ways. The ancient liturgies seemed to carry new weight, as if the words were seeds that had finally found fertile ground. Even among his fellow Pharisees, Nicodemus detected subtle shifts in conversation and concern. References to the teacher from Nazareth crept into their discussions with increasing frequency, though always couched in terms of caution and criticism. They spoke of the need to monitor his activities, to protect the people from dangerous innovations, to preserve the stability that their leadership provided. Yet beneath their official positions, Nicodemus sensed something else, a recognition that they were dealing with phenomena that their traditional categories could not easily contain. The very intensity of their opposition suggested that they too were aware of forces at work that transcended normal human experience. One did not marshal such determined resistance against ordinary religious enthusiasm or conventional false teaching. The urgency in their voices spoke of a threat to something much deeper than their institutional authority. They sensed, perhaps without fully admitting it to themselves, that the foundations of their world were being shaken by something they could neither understand nor control. Scripture itself seemed to whisper of these possibilities. The prophetic writings that Nicodemus had studied for decades suddenly pulsed with new relevance. Isaiah's words about a light shining in darkness, about the glory of the Lord being revealed so that all flesh might see it together, no longer felt like distant promises, but like descriptions of events that might unfold in his own lifetime. The ancient texts had always spoken of a time when God would do a new thing, when the normal patterns of divine interaction with humanity would give way to something unprecedented and transformative. Yet recognizing the possibility of divine intervention and actually encountering it were two entirely different matters. Nicodemus had spent his life interpreting texts about miraculous events, but he had never expected to be faced with evaluating miraculous claims in his own contemporary context. The comfortable distance between academic study and lived experience was collapsing in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. As evening approached and the shadows lengthened across the ancient stones of Jerusalem, Nicodemus found himself standing at a crossroads that extended far beyond the physical streets beneath his feet. The whispers of the unknown had become too persistent to ignore, the signs too numerous to dismiss, the stirrings in his own heart too profound to suppress. The teacher from Nazareth had somehow become the focal point of questions that had been building within him for years. The decision to seek a private audience was not made lightly. It represented a step across an invisible threshold, an acknowledgement that his carefully maintained position as a respected interpreter of established truth might not be sufficient for the times in which he lived. If God was indeed preparing to reveal himself in new and unprecedented ways, then even the most learned scholars might find themselves in the position of students once again. The night air carried a quality of expectation, as Nicodemus prepared for a journey that would take him far beyond the familiar boundaries of his religious and intellectual world. He was about to discover that some questions could only be answered through direct encounter, and some truths could only be received by those willing to risk everything they thought they knew in pursuit of everything they hoped might be true. The narrow stone pathways that threaded through Jerusalem's ancient districts had witnessed countless midnight journeys. But few carried the weight of spiritual urgency that pressed upon Nicodemus as he made his way through the sleeping city. The moon hung like a silver coin against the velvet sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward him with fingers of invitation and warning. His sandals whispered against the worn stones as he navigated streets that transformed completely in darkness. By day, these same pathways bustled with merchants hawking their wares, children playing games between the market stalls, and pilgrims from distant lands seeking directions to the temple. But now, in the profound quiet of the night hours, Jerusalem became a different city entirely. It became a place where a man could walk unrecognized, where conversations could unfold without the scrutinizing gaze of those who measured every word for its political and religious implications. The decision to seek this meeting had not come easily. For weeks, Nicodemus had wrestled with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve with each passing day. His scholarly training had equipped him to analyze complex theological problems, to weigh competing interpretations of sacred texts, and to arrive at reasoned conclusions through careful deliberation. But the situation confronting him now transcended the boundaries of conventional academic inquiry. Every fiber of his being as a religious leader cautioned him against this course of action. To approach an unrecognized teacher, someone who had not been vetted through the proper channels of religious authority, violated both explicit protocols and unspoken understandings about how divine truth was properly transmitted and received. His colleagues on the Sanhedrin would view such a meeting as, at best, an inexcusable lapse in judgment, and at worst a dangerous flirtation with forces that could undermine everything they had worked to preserve. Yet something deeper than institutional loyalty or professional caution drove him forward through the maze of darkened streets. The reports about Jesus of Nazareth had reached a threshold where they could no longer be dismissed as mere enthusiasm or collective delusion. Too many credible witnesses had spoken of teachings that pierced through layers of religious tradition to touch something fundamental about the nature of divine relationship. Too many reliable sources had described miraculous healings that defied natural explanation, yet bore all the hallmarks of genuine divine intervention. The very consistency of these accounts troubled Nicodemus in ways he struggled to articulate. If they were fabrications or exaggerations, one would expect to find contradictions and inconsistencies that would expose their fictional nature. Instead, the testimonies reinforced each other in ways that suggested they were attempting to describe experiences that exceeded the normal boundaries of human language and understanding. As he walked deeper into the night, Nicodemus found himself remembering conversations from his youth with older rabbis who had spoken wistfully of the days when God's presence seemed more immediate and accessible. They told stories of earlier generations when prophecy was more common, when the divine voice spoke more clearly through human vessels, when the boundary between heaven and earth appeared more permeable. These elderly teachers had often wondered aloud whether such times might come again, whether the God of their fathers might once more choose to reveal himself in ways that would astonish and transform his people. At the time, these conversations had seemed like nostalgic musings, the understandable longing of aged men for a more heroic and spiritually vibrant past. But now, as reports of extraordinary teachings and miraculous signs circulated throughout Jerusalem, Nicodemus wondered if those older rabbis had been speaking prophetically rather than merely nostalgically. Perhaps they had sensed something stirring in the spiritual atmosphere of their times, some subtle shift that indicated divine preparation for unprecedented revelation. The weight of his position as a teacher in Israel made this midnight journey both more necessary and more perilous. If Jesus of Nazareth was indeed a messenger sent from God, then Nicodemus had a responsibility to investigate and understand the nature of his mission. The people looked to religious leaders for guidance in distinguishing between authentic divine activity and the numerous false claims that regularly emerged in times of social and political tension. But if this teacher represented something genuinely transformative, then approaching him openly would expose Nicodemus to criticism and potential persecution from those who preferred the stability of established traditions. The darkness that surrounded his solitary walk served as both concealment and metaphor. Just as the physical shadows provided protection from unwanted observation, the spiritual darkness of his own uncertainties required the gentle illumination that only direct encounter could provide. Academic study and theological speculation had brought him to the edge of understanding, but some truths could only be received through personal engagement with their source. The address he sought lay in a quieter section of the city where temporary lodgings provided shelter for traveling teachers and their disciples. The building itself was unremarkable, constructed of the same limestone blocks that formed the foundation of countless Jerusalem structures. Yet as Nicodemus approached the entrance, he sensed that he was about to cross a threshold that extended far beyond the physical doorway before him. His heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the silent streets. This was more than nervousness about an unusual social encounter. This was the profound recognition that some moments in life serve as hinges upon which entire destinies turn. Whatever transpired in the conversation ahead would either confirm his growing suspicions about the extraordinary nature of Jesus of Nazareth, or it would provide the clarity needed to return to his established patterns of thought and teaching with renewed confidence. The cool night air carried the mingled scents of sleeping flowers and distant cooking fires, creating an atmosphere that felt both ordinary and charged with possibility. As Nicodemus raised his hand to announce his presence, he paused for one final moment to consider the magnitude of what he was about to undertake. Then, with the resolve of a man who had chosen truth over comfort, he knocked softly upon the door that would open into the most significant conversation of his life. The door opened without the creaking protest one might expect from ancient hinges, revealing a figure whose presence immediately filled the small space with an authority that transcended physical dimensions. Jesus of Nazareth stood in the threshold, not as Nicodemus had imagined him based on the various descriptions he had heard, but as someone whose very being seemed to bridge the gap between the earthly and the eternal. There was no surprise in those eyes, no question about why a Pharisee would appear at such an hour seeking private audience. It was as if this meeting had been anticipated, prepared for, woven into the fabric of divine intention long before Nicodemus had made his careful way through Jerusalem's sleeping streets. The recognition was mutual and immediate, though it operated on levels that exceeded mere human acknowledgement. The interior of the dwelling was simple, furnished with the basic necessities that traveling teachers required for temporary shelter. Oil lamps cast gentle pools of light that seemed to gather around the central figure in ways that defied the normal behavior of flame and shadow. Nicodemus found himself studying this man who had become the focus of so much speculation and controversy, searching for some external sign that would explain the extraordinary reports that had drawn him here. What he discovered was both more and less than he had expected. More, because the presence that emanated from this teacher carried a quality of divine authenticity that no amount of theological training could counterfeit or dismiss. Less because the external appearance was that of an ordinary man, someone who might pass unnoticed in any crowd, who bore none of the ostentatious markers that false messiahs typically employed to attract attention and establish credibility. The conversation began before either man had spoken a word. It unfolded in the realm of recognition where souls meet beyond the boundaries of social convention and religious protocol. Nicodemus felt simultaneously exposed and welcomed, as if layers of careful self-presentation were being gently peeled away to reveal the genuine seeker that dwelt beneath the respected teacher's carefully maintained exterior. When words finally broke the profound silence, they came not as the formal greeting one might expect between religious figures of different standing, but as responses to questions that had not yet been verbalized. Jesus spoke with the tone of someone continuing a conversation that had begun long before their physical meeting, addressing concerns and longings that Nicodemus had barely acknowledged to himself. The teaching that emerged transcended the normal categories of rabbinical discourse. These were not interpretations of existing texts or elaborations upon established traditions. Instead, they were revelations that seemed to flow directly from the source of all spiritual truth. Explanations of divine reality that made the familiar scriptures suddenly luminous with new meaning and possibility. Nicodemus found himself in the unfamiliar position of a student rather than a teacher. His carefully accumulated knowledge revealed as preliminary preparation for truths that exceeded everything he had previously understood about the nature of divine relationship. The concepts that Jesus presented challenged fundamental assumptions about how spiritual transformation occurred, about the requirements for authentic connection with the living God, about the very purpose of religious observance and moral striving. The metaphors that Jesus employed spoke to something deeper than intellectual understanding. They addressed the heart's longing for genuine encounter with the divine, the soul's recognition that external conformity to religious requirements could never satisfy the profound hunger for authentic spiritual life. The imagery of birth, of wind, of water and spirit painted pictures that the mind struggled to grasp, but that the heart received with immediate recognition. As the night deepened around their conversation, Nicodemus felt the foundations of his carefully constructed worldview shifting in ways that were both terrifying and liberating. The security of established interpretations gave way to the exhilarating uncertainty of direct encounter with living truth. The comfortable distance between academic study and personal transformation collapsed as he realized that the teacher before him was not merely offering new information but extending an invitation to enter into an entirely different quality of existence. The questions that had driven him to seek this meeting were being answered, but not in the ways he had anticipated. Instead of receiving explanations that would fit neatly into his existing theological framework, he was being offered a perspective that transformed the very questions themselves. The issues that had seemed so complex and troubling in the light of day revealed themselves as symptoms of a much deeper need. A need for the kind of spiritual rebirth that could only come through divine initiative. The oil lamps flickered as the night hours passed, their gentle light creating an atmosphere that seemed removed from ordinary time and space. In this sacred bubble of conversation, Nicodemus encountered truths that would reshape every aspect of his understanding about God, about himself, and about the purpose of human existence. He was receiving not just answers to his questions, but a complete reorientation of his spiritual compass. Yet even as his heart recognized the authenticity of what he was hearing, his mind grappled with the implications. To accept these teachings would mean acknowledging that his entire previous understanding of religious truth had been, at best, preliminary preparation for something infinitely greater. It would mean embracing a transformation that would affect not just his private beliefs but his public position, his relationships, his very identity as a teacher in Israel. The night air that drifted through the open windows carried the promise of dawn. But Nicodemus sensed that he was experiencing a different kind of sunrise, one that was illuminating territories of spiritual understanding that he had never imagined existed. The encounter was concluding, but its effects would reverberate through every remaining day of his life. The weight of revelation pressed down upon Nicodemus like a physical burden as he made his way back through Jerusalem's empty streets. The conversation that had unfolded in that humble dwelling had left him fundamentally altered, carrying within his chest a truth so profound that it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The familiar stones beneath his feet felt different now, as if he were walking through a world that had been quietly transformed while he slept. Dawn was still hours away, yet something had already awakened within him that could never again return to slumber. The careful distinctions between sacred and secular that had governed his entire life now seemed like arbitrary lines drawn in shifting sand. Everything had become sacred. Every breath carried the possibility of divine encounter. Every moment held the potential for transformation that defied human explanation. The teacher's words echoed in his mind not as mere concepts to be analyzed, but as living seeds that had taken root in soil that had been prepared through decades of longing and questioning. The notion of being born again was not a theological proposition to be debated, but a reality that he could feel stirring within the depths of his being. Something old was dying. Something entirely new was struggling to emerge. Yet with this spiritual awakening came a crushing awareness of the practical implications that stretched out before him like an impossible mountain range. How could he, Nicodemus the Pharisee, the respected teacher of Israel, the member of the Sanhedrin, integrate what he had just experienced into the carefully structured world of religious authority and social expectation? His colleagues would not merely disagree with the conclusions he was beginning to reach. They would view them as dangerous deviations from established truth, threats to the stability that their leadership provided in an already chaotic world. The very foundations of their shared understanding about how divine revelation operated would be called into question by what he had witnessed in that simple room. The political dimensions of his dilemma were equally daunting. Rome maintained its uneasy peace with Jewish religious authorities through a delicate balance of accommodation and control. Any movement that challenged established religious structures would inevitably attract the attention of Roman officials who had little patience for disruptions to their carefully maintained order. To associate himself openly with Jesus of Nazareth would be to risk not only religious censure but political persecution. His family relationships would suffer as well. The respect and honor that his position brought to his household were not merely personal achievements but family treasures that had been accumulated over generations of faithful service to religious tradition. His wife, his children, his extended relatives all shared in the benefits of his standing within the community. To jeopardize that standing for the sake of spiritual convictions that they might not understand would be to betray responsibilities that extended far beyond his individual conscience. Yet even as these practical concerns pressed upon his awareness, Nicodemus found himself unable to retreat from the truth that had been revealed to him. The encounter with Jesus had not been merely informational but transformational. It had awakened something within him that could not be put back to sleep, had opened doors that could not be closed, had illuminated territories of understanding that could not be unexplored. The wind that moved through Jerusalem's narrow streets seemed to whisper of the spiritual realities that Jesus had described. Like the wind itself, this divine activity could not be controlled or predicted, could not be channeled through established religious procedures or institutional frameworks. It moved where it willed, touched whom it chose, transformed what it encountered in ways that defied human explanation or management. Standing in the courtyard of his own home, surrounded by the symbols of his established life, Nicodemus felt the terrible weight of living between two worlds. Behind him lay the security of position and tradition, the comfortable certainties of established interpretation, the social connections that had defined his identity for decades. Ahead lay a path whose destination he could not see, whose requirements he could not fully understand, whose cost he was only beginning to calculate. The mission that was taking shape within his consciousness was not one that had been explicitly assigned, but one that was emerging from the intersection of divine revelation and human responsibility. If Jesus of Nazareth was indeed who he claimed to be, if the teachings he shared carried the authority of heaven itself, Then someone needed to serve as a bridge between this new understanding and the established religious community that desperately needed to hear it. But how could such a bridge be built without being destroyed in the process? How could truth be shared without triggering the defensive reactions that would prevent its reception? How could he honor both his calling as a seeker of divine truth and his responsibilities as a leader within existing religious structures? The questions multiplied in his mind like stars emerging in the pre-dawn darkness. Each potential course of action seemed to carry consequences that could prove devastating. To speak openly would invite immediate rejection and persecution. To remain silent would be to betray the very revelation that had transformed his understanding of divine purpose. To seek a middle path might satisfy no one and accomplish nothing. Yet as he wrestled with these impossible choices, Nicodemus began to sense that the same divine presence that had spoken through Jesus was also at work within his own heart, providing guidance that transcended human wisdom. The mission he was being called to undertake was not his to design or control, but his to receive and follow, trusting that the one who had initiated this encounter would also provide the wisdom and strength necessary to fulfill whatever role he was meant to play. The olive tree in his courtyard swayed gently in the night breeze, its ancient branches reaching toward stars that had witnessed countless human struggles with divine calling. Like that tree, Nicodemus realized he was being asked to remain rooted in his established place while allowing something entirely new to grow through him, to bear fruit that would nourish others even if he could not fully understand the nature of that nourishment. The impossible mission was not to abandon his position but to transform it. Not to reject his role as a teacher in Israel, but to discover what it meant to teach truths that exceeded the boundaries of traditional instruction. He was being called to become a secret disciple, one who would carry divine revelation within the very heart of religious establishment, planting seeds that would grow in darkness until the time came for them to emerge into light. The morning sunlight that streamed through the high windows of the Sanhedrin council chamber carried none of the warmth that Nicodemus had once associated with gathering together for religious deliberation. The familiar faces around the semicircular assembly bore expressions that had hardened over recent months into masks of suspicion and defensive determination. What had once been thoughtful discussions about interpreting divine law had devolved into strategic sessions focused primarily on protecting institutional authority. The name of Jesus of Nazareth hung in the air like smoke from a persistent fire, impossible to ignore despite repeated attempts to dismiss its significance. Reports continued to stream in from throughout the region, accounts of teachings that drew crowds away from established religious centers, healings that occurred without proper authorization from recognized authorities, and most disturbing of all, claims about the nature of divine relationship that bypassed centuries of carefully developed theological framework. Caiaphas, the high priest, spoke with the measured tones of a man accustomed to having his pronouncements carry the weight of final authority. His words painted the emerging situation in stark terms of institutional survival versus dangerous innovation, the stability that their leadership provided to Jewish communities throughout the region, was being threatened by teachings that encouraged people to seek direct access to divine truth, rather than relying on established channels of interpretation and guidance. The political dimensions of the crisis were equally pressing. Roman authorities had made it clear that they would tolerate Jewish religious autonomy only as long as it contributed to social order rather than disrupting it. Any movement that gathered large crowds, challenged established hierarchies, or generated popular enthusiasm could be viewed as a potential threat to imperial peace. The delicate balance that allowed Jewish religious leaders to maintain their authority within the Roman system required constant vigilance against anything that might provoke unwanted attention from provincial governors. Nicodemus sat in his accustomed place within this assembly, but everything about his perspective had been fundamentally altered by his midnight encounter. The arguments that his colleagues presented with such passionate conviction now sounded hollow to ears that had heard truth spoken with divine authority. The concerns about protecting institutional stability seemed petty compared to the profound spiritual transformation that he had witnessed and experienced. Yet he also understood the genuine fears that motivated their opposition. These were not evil men seeking to suppress truth out of malicious intent. They were religious leaders who had dedicated their lives to preserving and transmitting sacred traditions that had sustained Jewish identity through centuries of foreign domination and cultural pressure. Their resistance to change was rooted in a sincere belief that innovation in religious matters inevitably led to corruption and eventual dissolution of everything they held sacred. The burden of his secret knowledge weighed heavily upon Nicodemus as he listened to plan after plan being proposed for containing what they viewed as a dangerous religious enthusiasm. Some advocated for direct confrontation, challenging Jesus publicly in ways that would expose what they assumed to be the inadequacies of his teaching. Others preferred more subtle approaches, working to undermine his credibility through whispered campaigns that would gradually erode popular support. When the discussion turned to more extreme measures, Nicodemus felt compelled to speak, though he chose his words with careful precision. His appeal to legal procedure and fair hearing was framed in terms that his colleagues could accept, drawing on established precedents and recognized principles of justice. He did not reveal the source of his concern for ensuring that Jesus received proper consideration, presenting his argument instead as a matter of institutional integrity and procedural correctness. The dismissive response he received cut deeper than mere professional disagreement. The sarcasm and condescension directed toward him revealed how quickly collegial relationships could deteriorate when fundamental assumptions were challenged. Men who had respected his scholarship for decades now questioned his judgment, suggesting that his concern for legal niceties betrayed a dangerous naivety about the threats they were facing. The isolation that followed this exchange became a constant companion in the days and weeks that followed. Conversations would stop when he approached, resuming only after he had passed beyond hearing range. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent, then ceased entirely. The subtle but unmistakable signs of professional ostracism began to accumulate like small cuts that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively created a wound that affected every aspect of his daily life. His family felt the social pressure as well. His wife noticed the changes in how other women treated her in the marketplace, the slight coolness in voices that had once carried warmth and friendship. His children began asking questions about why their father seemed troubled, why the visitors who had once filled their home with learned conversation now appeared only rarely. The internal struggle that Nicodemus faced was compounded by his growing awareness of the broader conflict that was developing throughout Jewish society. The teachings of Jesus were creating divisions that extended far beyond religious leadership into families, communities, and established relationships. People were being forced to choose between loyalty to traditional authorities and attraction to revolutionary ideas about the nature of divine relationship. In the synagogues, debates raged about the proper interpretation of prophetic texts that some claimed were being fulfilled in their own generation. Merchants argued in the marketplace about whether miraculous healings could be authenticated through proper witnesses. Even children played games that reflected the adult conversations they overheard, dividing into groups that supported different positions on questions their young minds could barely comprehend. The resistance that Nicodemus encountered was not merely institutional but cultural, woven into the very fabric of a society that had learned to survive through careful adherence to established patterns and suspicious rejection of anything that threatened communal stability. Change was viewed as inherently dangerous, innovation as potentially catastrophic, and individual spiritual experience as subordinate to collective religious authority. Yet beneath the surface opposition, Nicodemus began to detect signs of deeper currents flowing in unexpected directions. Quiet conversations in shadowed corners revealed that he was not alone in his questions and uncertainties. Other religious leaders whispered their own doubts about the wisdom of blanket rejection without investigation. Scholars spoke privately about prophetic texts that seemed to align with current events in ways that demanded serious consideration. The age of resistance was also becoming an age of secret searching, as individuals throughout Jewish society grappled with questions that could not be answered through traditional channels. The very intensity of official opposition seemed to be generating underground streams of inquiry that flowed beneath the surface of public discourse, creating networks of connection among those who shared similar questions and concerns. Nicodemus found himself becoming a reluctant focal point for some of these hidden conversations, his known sympathy for procedural fairness making him a safe confidant for others who harbored their own uncertainties. Through these whispered exchanges, he began to understand that the resistance he had encountered was not as monolithic as it appeared, that cracks were beginning to appear in the apparently solid wall of institutional opposition. The flickering oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the scroll that lay open before Nicodemus in the quiet hours before dawn. Sleep had become elusive, replaced by nights spent wrestling with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve with each passing day. The familiar words of the prophets now pulsed with new urgency, as if ancient promises were stirring to life in ways that demanded immediate attention and response. Isaiah's writing spoke of light piercing darkness, of glory being revealed that would be seen by all flesh, of a servant who would bear the iniquities of many and yet see the travail of his soul with satisfaction. Passages that had once seemed safely distant, referring to events in some far future time, now carried an immediacy that made his hands tremble as he traced the sacred letters with his finger. The reports that reached Jerusalem from the regions where Jesus continued his teaching ministry painted pictures that defied conventional understanding. Crowds of thousands gathering to hear words that penetrated hearts like arrows of fire. Healings that restored not merely physical wholeness but spiritual vitality that transformed entire communities. Teachings that cut through centuries of accumulated interpretation to reveal truths that were both startlingly new and eternally ancient. Yet alongside these accounts of unprecedented divine activity came darker reports that filled Nicodemus with growing dread. The opposition to Jesus was intensifying, moving beyond theological disagreement toward active hostility that threatened to erupt into violence. Religious leaders from various factions were beginning to unite around their shared perception of threat, setting aside doctrinal differences in favor of common cause against what they viewed as dangerous innovation. Political tensions were escalating as well. Roman authorities were taking notice of the large gatherings and popular enthusiasm that accompanied Jesus' ministry, viewing them through the lens of potential insurrection rather than religious revival. The delicate balance that maintained Jewish autonomy within the imperial system was being strained by forces that neither Jewish nor Roman leaders fully understood or controlled. Nicodemus found himself caught between worlds that were moving toward inevitable collision. His position within the religious establishment provided him with insider knowledge of plans being developed to contain or eliminate what was perceived as the Jesus threat. Yet his secret conviction about the divine authority behind this teacher's ministry made him a witness to the tragic irony of religious leaders preparing to oppose the very revelation they had spent their lives claiming to serve. The visions that came to him in dreams and quiet moments of prayer were not the dramatic supernatural experiences that characterized the accounts of ancient prophets. Instead, they were profound insights that emerged from the intersection of scriptural study and contemporary events. Revelations about divine purpose that seemed to flow directly from the encounter that had transformed his understanding of spiritual reality. He saw the pattern that was emerging with crystalline clarity, recognizing in current events the fulfillment of prophetic scenarios that had been hidden in plain sight throughout the sacred writings. The servant songs of Isaiah were not merely poetic descriptions of some future deliverer, but detailed previews of events that were beginning to unfold before his very eyes. The promises of divine intervention were not distant hopes but present realities that required eyes of faith to perceive and hearts prepared to receive. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable. To understand the true significance of what was happening while being powerless to prevent the tragedy that seemed to be inevitable created a form of spiritual anguish that affected every aspect of his existence. Food lost its taste. Conversations became exercises in careful concealment, and even prayer felt like a struggle against forces that were determined to prevent divine purpose from being fulfilled. His attempts to influence his colleagues through subtle suggestions and careful reasoning met with increasing resistance and suspicion. The very fact that he continued to advocate for fairness and proper procedure in dealing with Jesus marked him as unreliable in the eyes of those who viewed the situation as requiring decisive action against an existential threat. His reputation for wisdom and scholarly judgment, accumulated over decades of faithful service, was being steadily eroded by his refusal to join wholeheartedly in the campaign against the teacher from Nazareth. The isolation that had begun as professional coolness was deepening into personal ostracism that affected every relationship in his life. Former friends avoided him, colleagues questioned his loyalty, and even family members began to express concern about his apparent sympathy for dangerous ideas. The social network that had sustained and nurtured his identity for decades was gradually dissolving, leaving him increasingly alone with convictions that he could not fully share without risking complete rejection. Yet in the depths of this gathering darkness, Nicodemus began to experience a different kind of illumination. The external supports that had once provided security were being stripped away, but something internal was growing stronger, more resilient, more deeply rooted in divine reality than anything that human institutions could provide or threaten. The faith that had been kindled during his midnight conversation with Jesus was proving to be remarkably durable under pressure, growing brighter rather than dimmer as circumstances became more challenging. The scripture passages that had once seemed like academic subjects for scholarly interpretation were becoming personal communications that spoke directly to his situation and provided guidance for navigating impossible circumstances. The promises of divine presence and protection that he had taught to others for years were being tested in his own experience, proving to be reliable anchors in storms that threatened to sweep away everything familiar and secure. Through the long watches of the night, as he sat alone with his scrolls and his troubled thoughts, Nicodemus began to understand that he was being prepared for something that would require every resource of faith and courage he could muster. The darkness that surrounded him was not merely the absence of light, but the necessary preparation for a revelation that would demand everything he had to give. The visions that came to him in these midnight hours were not of his own triumph or vindication, but of events that would require him to step forward from the shadows where he had taken refuge and make public declaration of convictions that he had kept carefully hidden. He saw himself participating in events of cosmic significance, playing a role in divine drama that would echo through centuries of human history. The cost of such participation was becoming increasingly clear. To follow his convictions to their logical conclusion would mean abandoning the safety of his established position, accepting rejection from those whose approval he had spent his life seeking to maintain, and embracing an uncertain future that offered no guarantees except the promise of divine presence in whatever lay ahead. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Nicodemus closed his scrolls and prepared to face another day of careful navigation between truth and prudence, conviction and survival. The darkness was not yet complete, but neither was the light that would eventually pierce it. He was living in the time between times when the old was passing away but the new had not yet fully emerged, when faith meant walking forward without being able to see the destination clearly. The air in Jerusalem carried an electric tension that seemed to press against the skin like an approaching thunderstorm. For 3 years, the teacher from Nazareth had moved through the region like a gathering wind, drawing crowds that grew larger and more passionate with each passing season. The religious establishment's attempts to contain his influence had only seemed to amplify his message, while Roman authorities watched with increasing nervousness as popular enthusiasm reached levels that threatened their carefully maintained control. Nicodemus had observed this building crisis from his unique position within the religious hierarchy, watching as events unfolded with the inexorable precision of ancient prophecy coming to fulfillment. The secret knowledge he carried made every development both expected and heartbreaking, as he witnessed the collision between divine revelation and human resistance playing out exactly as the scriptures had foretold. The final week arrived with deceptive calm. As pilgrims streamed into Jerusalem for the Passover celebration that commemorated Israel's liberation from Egyptian bondage. The city swelled with visitors who brought their own expectations about what this particular Passover might bring. Their conversations filled with whispered speculation about whether the teacher who had captured the imagination of so many might choose this moment to reveal his true intentions. The triumphal entry that marked Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem was both magnificent and tragic. A moment of popular recognition that revealed how completely the crowds had misunderstood the nature of the kingdom he had come to establish. The palm branches and shouted hosannas spoke of expectations for political liberation and national restoration, hopes that would be shattered within days by events that would redefine the very meaning of victory and defeat. Nicodemus watched from his position among the religious leaders as Jesus entered the temple courts and began teaching with an authority that needed no human validation or institutional approval. The questions and challenges that were directed toward him were answered with wisdom that cut through layers of accumulated tradition to reveal truths that were both startling and undeniable. Even those who came to trap him with clever arguments found themselves confronted with insights that exposed the inadequacy of their own understanding. The decision to move against Jesus was made in secret councils, where Nicodemus found himself increasingly isolated as the only voice advocating for caution and proper procedure. The arguments that carried the day were not based on careful evaluation of his teachings but on political calculation about the threats his continued influence would pose to established order. The very success of his ministry was presented as evidence of its dangerous nature. The arrest, when it came, was swift and brutal, carried out under cover of darkness by men who feared the reaction of crowds that had demonstrated such enthusiasm for the teacher's message. Nicodemus was not present for the betrayal in the garden, but he heard about it within hours, along with reports of the hasty trials that violated numerous provisions of Jewish law in their determination to reach a predetermined conclusion. The crucifixion itself was Roman efficiency applied to the elimination of what imperial authorities viewed as a potential threat to public order. The method was designed not merely to execute but to humiliate, to demonstrate the futility of challenging Roman power through the public degradation of anyone foolish enough to attract unwanted attention. The site chosen for this demonstration was visible from throughout the city, ensuring that the message would be received by as many people as possible. Yet as Nicodemus made his way through Jerusalem's streets on that dark Friday, he carried within his heart knowledge that transformed the apparent defeat into something else entirely. The scriptures that had guided his understanding throughout this crisis spoke not of failure but of fulfillment. Not of the end of divine purpose, but of its ultimate expression through suffering that would accomplish what no earthly victory could achieve. The decision to come forward at the moment of apparent defeat was not one that Nicodemus made through careful deliberation, but one that emerged from the depths of conviction that had been growing within him for 3 years. The teacher who had once welcomed him in midnight conversation was now hanging lifeless on a Roman cross, his body bearing the marks of torture and execution. Yet something within Nicodemus recognized that this moment of ultimate vulnerability was also the moment for ultimate witness. Joseph of Arimathea had already taken the courageous step of requesting the body from Pilate, using his own position and influence to ensure that Jesus would receive proper burial, rather than the common grave reserved for executed criminals. But proper burial required more than just a tomb. It required the spices and preparation that would honor the deceased and demonstrate the respect that the living wished to show. The 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes that Nicodemus carried through Jerusalem's streets on that Friday afternoon represented more than burial preparation. The extraordinary quantity spoke of his recognition of who was being buried, his acknowledgement that this was no ordinary death but the departure of royalty. The cost was enormous, the equivalent of a laborer's wages for several years. But expense was irrelevant when measured against the significance of the one being honored. The public nature of his action marked the end of his time as a secret disciple. There was no way to carry such a quantity of burial spices through the city without attracting attention. No possibility of participating in such a burial without making a clear statement about where his loyalties lay. The very visibility of his devotion served as his final declaration of faith, his public acknowledgement of convictions that he could no longer keep hidden. The spices that Nicodemus carried that day were more than burial preparation. They were a declaration written in myrrh and aloes, a testimony that would echo through centuries. The secret disciple had finally stepped into the light, not in triumph but in sorrow, not in victory but in love that transcended even death itself. From midnight conversations to public witness, from whispered questions to costly devotion, Nicodemus had walked a path that transformed him from seeker to servant, from student to sacrifice. His story reminds us that faith often grows in darkness before it blooms in light, that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it, and that sometimes the most powerful witness comes not in moments of glory, but in acts of tender mercy when all seems lost. The man who once came to Jesus under cover of night ultimately found the courage to honor him in broad daylight, teaching us that authentic discipleship is measured not by the boldness of our beginnings, but by the faithfulness of our endings. In a world that still struggles with the tension between public reputation and private conviction, Nicodemus stands as an eternal reminder that love ultimately finds a way to declare itself even when the cost seems too great to bear. If this journey through the shadows and into the light has touched your heart, take a moment to let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to continue exploring these powerful stories of faith and transformation, and discover how the next video reveals another hidden figure whose courage changed the course of history forever.